Why is it that so many of the critical scholars of the Bible that you see here on TikTok, they block you the second you call them out on their bad scholarship?
Hey everybody, the fit today needs no introduction, but normally here I would say, all right, let's see it. But this isn't about me today. This is actually addressed to a friend of mine named Alexiana Fry, who is a wonderful scholar of the Old Testament, doing a postdoc right now at the University of Copenhagen. And she recently published Trauma Talks in the Hebrew Bible, Speech Act Theory, and Trauma Hermeneutics. And she looks at what insights can be gained from applying a hermeneutic of trauma to the Hebrew Bible, what that can tell us about different stories in the Hebrew Bible, and how people who have trauma in their lives engage with the biblical text. And it happens to be just one such discussion that has earned her the ire of this creator. Take a look.
Where she talks about the episode in which Saul is chosen, and then the Spirit comes upon Saul. Saul, when he is seized by the Spirit, speaks uncontrollably, essentially becomes another person. This is in chapter 10, verse 6. He gets another heart, 10, verse 9. And then he is no longer in control of his body. He's possessed. This is 10:10. What people miss is that the verb that's used here, salak, involves penetrative, forcible entry. Happens to both Saul and David, but we'll talk about the distinction here. She actually writes when she talks about these things, if Saul were a female character, we might be more inclined to notice and interrogate Adonai's forceful penetration of the body, one that, it goes without saying, features no room for consent.
So a couple things to note here. She's talking about this article here by Barbara Theda that was published last year, Hidden in Plain Sight, Saul's Male Trauma Narrative in 1 Samuel, which is also applying this hermeneutic of trauma to the text to see what insights we can extract from it, and also how we can better understand how a person living with trauma might approach these texts. And here is the section that she is starting from. Now, the other thing to note is that this interpretation of this verb, salak, as meaning penetrate or force entry to, is uncontroversial. In fact, in my own book, Adonai's Divine Images, I talk precisely about how this verb in this exact story means to force entry into. Here is the page where I discuss this, and this is within a broader discussion of the conceptualization of the body as a container and the spirit primarily functioning on the interior of the body, and so how God's spirit goes inside the body. And I'm also talking about the constitution of personhood, and so the idea that Saul's heart is constitutive of his personhood is also reflected in this story. But the idea that the verb there, salak, means to force entry into is widely accepted, is uncontroversial, is in all of the lexicons and dictionaries. Now, here's how this creator in philosopher's garb responded.
David will be properly oiled up before experiencing divine penetration.
What in the erotic biblical fan fiction are you talking about? This woman who advertises herself as an Old Testament PhD is a perfect example of why the letters next to a person's name should not be taken as even remotely indicating that they know what they are talking about.
Now, I want to jump back in here to point out that she was talking about someone else's publication. She was quoting from a paper that was peer-reviewed and was published in a standard academic journal, Biblical Interpretation. But back to what In Philosopher's Garb is doing with this.
All it says is that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Saul, and then he prophesied. So what are we missing here that she is seeing?
What people miss is that the verb that's used here, salak, involves penetrative, forcible entry.
No, it doesn't. The Hebrew word that is used here is most commonly translated as rushed, succeeded, prospered, or something being attained. So why is she jumping on this idea of seized or penetration? Likely because of some scholarly discussions surrounding the root of this word. As the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament remarks, evidence shows, however, that the root could exhibit so the idea of penetration is something that is discussed regarding this word, but is discussed as being an early phase in the semantic development of this root. Trying to take this one specific earlier phase of this one root's meaning and insert it into this context is naive.
So this creator seems to be reading this entry from T. to mean that there was a time when it meant to penetrate, force entry into, but it has since evolved, and the usage in the Hebrew Bible doesn't refer to that anymore. And if that's how they're reading this, that is flatly wrong, because the whole reason they bring this up is because they're rejecting earlier scholarship that looks at the usage and says they're using it to mean different things, therefore maybe we're dealing with different roots. And T. is saying, no, it's the same root. It has just undergone change in the senses associated with it, and the old senses are still around. That's what gives it the illusion of being different roots. So yes, it absolutely can and does mean to penetrate, to force entry into, as T. itself recognizes in other parts of that entry. But you can also look at the standard biblical Hebrew lexicon, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. Here's the relevant page, and you can see down in the bottom left, be, intransitive, to force entry into, with the preposition al, where the subject is Adonai or Elohim. And then you see our verses listed, 1s, 10, 6, and 10. There is no lexical argument to make that this verb cannot, or in these passages does not, refer to forcing entry into penetrating. That is how spirit possession was conceptualized in the ancient world. That is how prophecy, and specifically ecstatic prophecy, was conceptualized in the ancient world. This is uncontroversial, and this creator does not have the first clue what they are talking about. Now, this creator is going to go on to quote Genesis 24 and 39 and 2 Samuel 19 as indicating what this verb actually means, but they're entirely ignoring that none of the usages they quote have Adonai or Elohim or the Spirit as the subject of the verb, and none of them use the preposition al or the preposition el. Additionally, the two Genesis passages are using the verbal root in the hithil causative stem rather than in the call. So this creator very clearly does not know how to deal with lexical arguments in biblical Hebrew. And that last passage in 2 Samuel 19, if they looked back in T. they would see that the authors of that entry suggest that 2 Samuel 19 might also be appealing to that penetrate, force entry into sense.
My best guess is that the suggestion of penetration is being asserted because this woman is a feminist, and like many feminists, she wants to make everything in the world about penetration and abuse.
Now, the video goes on for a few more minutes in similarly dogmatic and condescending and naive ways, but I just want to share how it ends.
I want to conclude by saying that while the remarks offered by this woman are an embarrassment to all of academia, this should not be taken as a representation of all feminist scholars. There are areas in which feminist scholarship have made great contributions to biblical and theological thought. It's just a shame that those good scholars get lumped into the same crazy, overly sexualized nonsense that this woman is spouting.
Now, again, Alexiana is quoting another person's peer-reviewed and published scholarship, but also both her scholarship and this other person's scholarship is applying a hermeneutical lens to the Bible of trauma. And she's explicitly not trying to say this is what the authors intended. In fact, in a follow-up video, here's what she says.
I don't think that the text, the authorship, and all of that, I don't think that that's what they're trying to espouse. I definitely don't think that. I definitely agree that the text is trying to go with the ideology that you would prefer. Great.
From there, Alexiana goes on to point out that she's 100% correct about the fact that the verbal root salak can mean, in the context of spirit possession, penetrate, force entry into, and as I have shown, she is 100% correct about that, and she argues that the source in Philosopher's Garb used actually supports her argument over and against his, and as I have demonstrated, that's absolutely correct. In Philosopher's Garb, just misunderstood and does not have a good grasp of biblical Hebrew. But she misidentified that source as halot rather than as T. And so in the video talks about the entry in halot. And then in the comments, she points out that she has blocked in Philosopher's Garb. Obviously, she doesn't need to be subjected to that kind of condescending and gendered belligerence. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with her doing that. As she points out in her videos, she's not here to engage in these back and forth debates. She's just not interested in that. So let's see how In Philosopher's Garb takes that.